The most important question in planning a church is, what is a church? The most important question to answer when planning a church is, what is a church? If you want to plan a church, you need to know the answer to that question. What is a church? That's the most important thing to know when planning a church. What is a church? Do I need to say it again? The most important thing to know in planning a church is, what is a church? My friend Joshua was born in China. That's his English name, Joshua. And when he moved to Shanghai, to university in Shanghai, somebody shared the gospel with him and he became a Christian. And he graduated from university in Shanghai and he became an engineer and began sharing the gospel. And the Lord blessed Joshua's evangelism ministry, and people came to know Christ. And they would come to his house church and be baptized by his pastor, but because that house church was full, they couldn't actually join that little house church. And so instead, they would meet in Joshua's studio apartment there in Shanghai on Wednesday nights for a Bible study. And Joshua shared the gospel. More and more people came to trust in Christ. 5 people, 10 people, 15 people, 20, eventually 30, 35 people were meeting in Wednesday nights in his one-room studio apartment there in Shanghai for a Bible study. Praise the Lord. Well, Joshua decided, I think I want to go get a PhD in engineering. So I'm going to move to Singapore. And all the members of the Bible study said, well, no, you can't go to Singapore. You have to stay here and lead our church. And he said, this is not a church. We're a Bible study. And they said, no, this is a church. And he said, well, no, you need to find a church and find a pastor. And they said, well, you're our pastor. He's like, I've been leading the Bible study, but I'm not a pastor. Well, that situation right there is sort of like a church laboratory. What do you have to pour in to get a church? Poof, there's a church. Is that Bible study a church? Well, what makes a church a church? They were opening the Bible, they were reading and teaching from it, they were singing songs, they were praying. Does that make it a church? Well, that's the question every planter needs to know the answer to. What makes a church a church? Well, what did the Lutherans say? A church is a congregation of saints in which the gospel is rightly taught and the sacraments rightly administered. That's the Augsburg Confession. What do the Anglicans say? Very similarly, they say in the 39 Articles, a congregation of faithful men in which the pure word of God is taught and the sacraments be duly administered. The Presbyterians in Westminster Confession would say it's those that profess true religion and their children in particular churches which are more or less pure according to the doctrine of the gospel is taught and embraced, ordinances administered, and public worship performed. And then the Baptists in the First London Baptist Confession would say a church is a company of visible saints called and separated from the world by the Word and the Spirit of God to the visible profession of the faith of the gospel, being baptized into the faith and joined to the Lord and each other by mutual agreement in the practical enjoyment of the ordinances. All 4 of these definitions, I would say, are basically pointing to the same thing, a congregation of Christians, the Presbyterians say, and their children, where the gospel's taught and where the ordinances or the sacraments are practiced. What I like about the Baptist definition is it adds that phrase, by mutual agreement. Now, I would say that's implicit in the first 3 definitions, that when you're giving the ordinances in a Lutheran, Anglican, Presbyterian, There's an agreement that they should be given. But I like the fact that the Baptist Confession makes that explicit by mutual agreement. Well, those are some of the historical answers given to the question, what is a church? Turn to Matthew 16. We're going to spend a little bit of time in Matthew 16 and 18, thinking about Jesus' instruction for what makes a church a church. In the first part of the chapter, Jesus warns the apostles not to trust the teaching of Israel's leaders. And then you see in verse 13, he says, who do people say the Son of Man is? And then he asks that question again in verse 15, who do you guys say I am? Jesus is interested in a what and a who. What is a right confession of who I am, and who of you know it? Right? Simon Peter's answers, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus affirms Peter's answer on behalf of heaven. He says, my Father in heaven has revealed this to you. And then interestingly, Jesus says, verse 18, and I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. It appears that Jesus is giving Peter the same authority that Jesus just exercised with Peter, the authority to stand on earth and affirm right confessions and right confessors, a what and a who, on behalf of heaven. And notice Jesus says he's going to build his church on this rock. What is the rock? Well, historically, Romans Catholics would say, well, it's Peter, at least the Pope. Protestants, in reaction to that, say, well, no, it's Peter's confession. Most evangelical commentaries these days say, well, it's Peter, grammatically it's Peter, but it's Peter because Peter's confessing the right confession. Or as Ed Clowney, the Presbyterian theologian Ed Clowney puts it, the confession cannot be separated from Peter, neither Peter can be separated from his confession. Jesus is going to build his church on confessors confessing the right confession, right? And then he gives Peter these keys. Keys are a symbol of authority. But do these keys open and shut? Well, more specifically, they bind and loose. They bind and loose on earth what's bound and loosed in heaven. What is binding and loosing? Well, it's a rabbinic way of talking about interpreting the law and then rendering judgment on a case of the law. So the rabbis would have debated, when did Moses say a woman can get divorced or a man can get divorced? And these circumstances, those circumstances, when they would interpret Moses' law, and then they would render a judgment on that law. This man can or cannot divorce this woman, or this woman, this man. So they interpret, and then they apply in an act of judgment. Again, there's a what does the law say? And there's a who. How does it or does it not apply to them? The authority of the keys is the authority to render judgment on the what and the who of the gospel, who Jesus is. Let me say that again. The authority of the keys is the authority to render a judgment, to make a formal declaration on the what and the who of the gospel. Is that the true gospel? Is that a true gospel confessor that we're talking about? It's like what a judge does. Does a judge make the law the law? Well, no, they interpret the law. And then does the judge make a person actually guilty or innocent? Well, no, but they have a legal authority to declare somebody innocent or not, guilty or not guilty. And so it is with whoever's holding the keys. The key holder, be it an apostle or a church, which we'll get to in a second, does not create the gospel. Rather, they said, yes, that's who Jesus is. That's the true gospel. Nor does the holder keys actually make somebody a Christian. But they have a legal authority on earth to represent heaven, the kingdom of heaven, the rule of heaven. Okay, so in Matthew 16, the apostles are said to hold the keys. Does anybody else hold the keys? Well, turn to Matthew 18, where Jesus puts the keys into the hands of the local church. Look at verses 15 and 16. There's a dispute, a sinful dispute. A man's confronted a couple of times, first by one, and then verse 16 by a few more, so that a matter may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. Okay, we're in a courtroom-like setting here, right? And then the man still doesn't listen. Verse 17, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. That is to say, somebody outside of the covenant community. And then, okay, on what basis is this action taken? Well, truly I say to you, whatever you, those of you with Dutch Bibles, I trust you can see that this is in the plural. Back in verse 16, it was in the singular, you. Whatever you, Peter, bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Now, it's in English, we would, Derek from Texas would say, y'all. Whatever y'all bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever y'all loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. And most other languages, like the Greek, you can see that distinction there. Verse 19, again I say, okay, you don't understand? Let me say it again. Again I say to you, if 2 of you agree on earth about anything they ask, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. There's that word agreement. They need to agree by mutual agreement. And what's the basis for all of this authority? By what basis do they all act? For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I among them. Does that mean Jesus is there floating like a cloud, a mystical fog? I can feel him. Can you feel him? No, he's saying they speak for me. They represent my authority. My flag flies there. They're wearing my jersey. Notice there's no mention of pastors or elders in these verses. Our Presbyterian or Dutch Reformed friends would say, well, now ordinarily the pastors or elders represent the church when they're taking actions, but if you look at historical Presbyterian and Reformed theology, even writers like Bavinck would say, but the church possesses that authority. The gathered church possesses all authority. Now, where Baptists and Presbyterian or Reformed would disagree is whether or not the elders can exercise that authority on behalf of the church. But we all agree that congregations of believers possess that authority. And so it is here, the congregation, the gathered church, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, they speak for me. When they come together by mutual agreement, they speak for me. Jesus has authorized the local gathered visible church. Again, we can disagree on whether or not the elders independently can represent them, but we can all agree that Jesus has authorized the local church to stand in front of a confessor, to consider the confessor's confession, and to announce an official judgment on heaven's behalf. That's a true confession. That's a true confessor, or not. And it will do these things with the ordinances, which Jesus then establishes in Matthew 26, Matthew 16, Matthew 18, Matthew 26. He establishes the Lord's Supper, and then Matthew 28, in which he establishes baptism. We'll come back to that in a moment. But what I want to make sure you understand is the key-holding local church has authority, heaven's authority, not to make a Christian, but to declare who is and who is not a Christian, and what is not a true confession, which we do through, go back to those historical confessions of faith, which we do through preaching and the ordinances, or the sacraments. It's like this. When I was in college, I spent 5 months in Brussels, Belgium, working in the European Parliament, and while I was there, my passport expired. So I went down to the U.S. Embassy there in Brussels, and I handed them my expired passport, And they did their work, and they handed me a new passport. Did they make me an American citizen on that day? Well, no, I was already an American citizen. But did they have an authority I do not possess as an individual American citizen to declare me, before the nations, to declare me a U.S. citizen? Well, yes, they did. Well, in the same way, what is a local church? It's an embassy, an outpost, an embassy of, not America, not Nigeria, not Japan. It's an embassy of the kingdom of heaven, rendering judgments on the what and the who of the gospel through holding the keys of the kingdom. The local church is an embassy of God on planet Earth. It doesn't make people Christians, but it hands out those passports and publicly declares who is God's, who is Christ's on planet Earth. So when does the Bible study become a church? When does this brand new gathering of people, this plant, become a church? Well, it's when they begin to preach the gospel and practice the ordinances in mutual agreement. Yes, we are all Christians here. A company of visible saints being baptized into the faith and joined to the Lord and each other by mutual agreement in the practical enjoyment of the ordinances. A Bible study, think about it. A Bible study is a voluntary society. You can come, you can not come. Doesn't matter. It's something you're interested in. We come together around a shared interest in reading the Bible. A Bible study has no requirements for your life if you do come. I'm sleeping with my girlfriend. You shouldn't sleep with your girlfriend. Well, I'm going to sleep with my girlfriend. Okay. A Bible study does not involve a shared family name, Christian, brother, sister. There's no accountability inside of it. You can come, you can go, you're on your own, right? Whereas when you step into, I can walk. I'm a little tired. It's 1 a.m. for me right now, or 2 a.m. When you step into a church, you step into an accountability structure. You step into an organized gathering. You take the family name, brother, sister, Christian, right? There's a requirement for you to come. Do not forsake the assembling of yourselves, right, says the author of Hebrews. There's an expectations of how you live. I'm sleeping with my girlfriend. Well, you can't do that. Well, I want to do that. Well, if you continue to do that, we're going to have to remove you as an act of discipline, which we'll think about more in the next session. In other words, moving from Bible study into church is a significant thing. There's a job involved. And we all have a job to do in caring for one another inside of this family structure. When I was a child, I have 3 siblings, and we would go places, and my grandma would always say to us as we get out of the family van and we go into some place, my grandma would say, "Now make sure you act like a Leeman." Now, for some reason, Grandma thought that being a Leeman meant something. We did our best to prove her wrong, but you understand what she meant, right? To be a Leeman means something. Okay, well, to be a Christian means something when you take the family name. When you step from Bible study or conference into a church by mutual agreement. Notice I haven't said anything about even pastors so far. Finally, it's the church that makes the church a church. Again, if you go back and you look at old Presbyterian theologies, James Bannerman talks about a desert island with no elders, no pastors. The church still has all the power it needs to be a church because we are born again by Christ. So my own church, for instance, I'm a member of Cheverly Baptist Church. And it began in 2018. How did that happen? Well, there was 1,000 of us who were all members of Capitol Hill Baptist Church. And we were there on Capitol Hill. And about 100 of us lived out in this suburb, this Maryland suburb called Cheverly. And we thought to ourselves, there's no faithful church here in Cheverly. It would be great for there to be a faithful church in Cheverly, because our Cheverly non-Christian neighbors, they're not going to drive down to Capitol Hill on a Sunday morning. And so it just feels like a world apart. So we would love to have a church here that we could invite them to. So 3 of us who are elders at Capitol Hill Baptist Church talked to John. John was an associate pastor who was thinking about moving to Texas to plant a church or become a pastor in Texas. We said, Texas is enough churches. We want you to be a pastor here in Cheverly. Would you be interested in considering that? And he talked to his wife, and they agreed. Well, let's think about planting this church in Cheverly. So 3 elders and 1 lead elder, John, one lead pastor, John, went to the elders of Capitol Hill and said, we'd like to plant a church in Cheverly. And they said, that sounds wonderful. And so we went before the whole church and said, a bunch of us live in Cheverly. We'd like to plant a church. So if you're interested, why don't you come talk to one of the 4 of us about being involved? Over the fall, that was in the summer, in the fall, we had a series of Sunday night gatherings in which we called them information meetings, in which we told anybody who wanted to come about what we would be doing and how we would be the same as Capitol Hill Baptist, but maybe a couple of ways would be a little different than Capitol Hill Baptist, and how we thought it would work. And we just shared a lot of information of what would happen with this church plant. And we continued to encourage them, hey, come talk to us if you have questions about this and if you're interested. And in the main church at Capitol Baptist, during our prayer services and during services, we would make announcements, and we would invite the whole congregation, all 1,000 people, to be praying for us and involved in it. And then finally, we said to them, listen, if you're ready to commit to this, come tell one of the 4 of us that you're ready to commit. And we'd have private conversations with all of them who were members of Capitol Baptist, making sure they understood the gospel, making sure we were all on the same page about that. And then finally, that was in the fall, those information meetings on Sunday night. Then in February of the following year, we had what we called dress rehearsals at a school building in Cheverly, in our little suburb. And about 60 to 70 people joined us, and from Capitol Hill Baptist, plus 3 people who were from some other church, but almost everybody came from Capitol Hill, from the mother church. And we preached, we prayed, we sung. We treated the first 3 Sundays of February like an ordinary church service, but we didn't take the Lord's Supper. And we did not open it to the public. We only opened it to those people who were committed to joining together with us. So we did that for 3 Sundays. And then on the 4th Sunday, at the very end of the service, we'd been talking to the people, and we'd shown them all a confession, and we'd shown them all a constitution, and we'd all shown them all a covenant, those 3 documents, a confession of faith saying what we believe, a covenant saying how we will live, and a constitution, which is our word for talking about this is how we're going to be organized and how we make decisions together. And we had those 3 documents, and we'd been sharing them with people for several months, and they'd given us feedback, and we'd agreed on, okay, it's going to be these 3 things, which would define who we are and what we believe. So on that 4th Sunday in February, we invited them all to come. We went through all of the steps of an ordinary service, and at the end, we took the Lord's Supper. By taking the Lord's Supper, we understood ourselves to be constituting as a church by mutual agreement. And then after we took the Lord's Supper, we next voted on the confession, voted on the covenant, voted on the Constitution as a way of kind of embodying what we were doing in the Lord's Supper and constituting as a church. At that point, I then nominated John Joseph to be our lead pastor, and we all voted on John. And then he nominated the other 3 guys to be elders, and then they voted on us as elders. And at this point, we had a church and a rightly ordered church with elders. And notice the order in which we did that. We did that very deliberately. First the church, and the elders of the church. And at that point, we celebrated. Here we are, Cheverly Baptist Church. No longer just a plant, but a real, bona fide church. Taking the Lord's Supper and then moving forward in baptism. A company of visible saints being baptized into the faith and joined to the Lord and each other by mutual agreement in the practical enjoyment of the ordinances. So what happened to Joshua Shi in Shanghai? Well, he was going to leave and do a PhD in Singapore, as I said, but they prevailed upon him to not go do a PhD and be an engineer, but to stay in Singapore. And so he did. And they moved from Bible study into church by beginning to meet on Sundays instead, and by beginning to practice the Lord's Supper and baptizing. And poof, they were a church.